Welcome to the latest of our series of revision videos on early Elizabethan England. Our focus today will be on key topic 3, Elizabethan society in the age of exploration. Today's key content is on part 1, which is education and leisure during Elizabethan England. From the specification today, we'll be looking at the idea of education in the home, in schools and universities, and also looking at Elizabethan sport, pastimes, and the theatre. So let's focus first off on attitudes and influences on education during the time period. So in terms of attitudes, is that education was becoming increasingly valuable, and it still reflected the social hierarchy of the country. So therefore, the very rich were able to become educated, and the poor didn't get anything. And therefore, any education that you would receive as part of being rich or better off was aimed at preparing you for the life that you expected to lead. And it's not as it is currently regarding social mobility in terms of bettering oneself from your previous generations. It's usually focused on practical skills, but could also include basic literacy as well. But only a small percentage of children, and it was mainly boys, that went to school at all. So in terms of what influenced education during this time period, is that you've got humanism. So humanists believed learning was important in its own right, and they therefore didn't believe that people should just be educated for practical reasons. The philosophy and math, was studied to grasp a better understanding of the world, and therefore it was viewed that it was important for humans to stop being superstitious and to fulfil their potential. Now, when we look at the idea of education, this part and influence, we've got to remember that this is aimed still at the very rich, because during this time period we've got the idea of witchcraft, which links into the crime and punishment topic, where people were very, very superstitious, and it was normally those that were uneducated that were more superstitious than those that were educated. You've also got an influence from Protestantism, and they believed people should be able to read the Bible in their own language and to develop their relationship with God. Remember that pre-Reformation and with Catholicism is that the Bible and services were written in Latin. So therefore, inside of a church is that people very rarely understood what was actually going on with regards to the service or the writings within the Bible itself. And lastly, is the idea that because of the development in business and trade, it meant that basic education became more important, particularly in towns, with regards to those that were working as merchants. So let's have a look at one such educational establishment, which is the idea of the development of grammar schools. So this is the biggest change in Elizabethan education, in that we do still have grammar schools today in certain areas of the country, Kent being one of them. There's also a couple in Essex, and there's also one in Redbridge as well. So there were about 75 grammar schools founded in the 1560s and 1570s, and it used to be down to the church to provide the education to children. Grammar schools were set up for boys considered bright from well-off families in towns, and fees were charged for attendance. The school year was much longer than what we have today, and holidays were only at Christmas and Easter. So therefore, there wouldn't be 6 weeks worth of summer holidays that we have now. It would only be at Christmas and Easter because they are the high holidays of Christianity, and the school days were roughly double in length to what we currently have, so they're about 10 hours in length. So the key aspect of grammar schools was to do with the idea of public speaking and debating, and that was thought to be essential for a well-educated Elizabethan gentleman. So when we look at the idea of education, we've also got to look at the idea of the punishments that were within the schools at the time. So the teacher maintained discipline inside the classroom, not quite the same type of discipline as what you'd see in the classroom today. But you've also got the idea of boys that were monitors, so the people that would report misbehaviour that happened outside the classroom. So anyone that was reported were questioned on Mondays at 9 a.m. by the headmaster, and they were then suitably punished. And those punishments included being kept in at break time, being on report, corporal punishment, and exclusion from school. Now, what you'll probably notice there is three of those. Three of those are used in schools today. So, for example, being kept in at break time is the usual detention. Some of you have been on report to a formal tutor or head of house at some point in your school life. And you've also got, for the most serious, is to be excluded from school. The one that is no longer in use is to do with corporal punishment, which is to do with the idea of being caned or whipped or beaten because of the actions that you've taken. So, in terms of other areas of education, you've got the idea of petty schools. Okay, so they would normally run within a teacher's home themselves, and that would be your basic education in terms of reading, writing, and arithmetic, otherwise known as the three R's. And the punishment was often harsh, with beatings for poor behaviour because you're within someone's home. Now, the bright or well-off boys would attend grammar schools after they have attended the petty schools. So we're kind of looking at petty schools as the concept of a basic kind of primary school kind of level education. In terms of schools for girls, if girls did attend schools, they would normally attend dame schools, and again, that would often be run by a local woman that was educated. That education focused on the requirements of the home and the skills for running the home. So therefore, we're talking about the preservation of food, baking, and sewing. The pinnacle of education in Elizabethan England is universities. So there are only two universities in Elizabethan England, and that was Oxford and Cambridge. And given the reputation and given the idea that they are still the pinnacle of university education in England today. So you normally start university at around about 14 or 15 rather than 18 or 19 as you would do today, with the curriculum focusing primarily on geometry, music, and philosophy. Oxford and Cambridge universities, now there are a number, it's not just one university. So there's a university, but there's a number of different colleges. So if anyone's ever watched University Challenge on BBC Two, you'll find that Oxford and Cambridge tend to be on there a lot, but under different guises of different colleges. So Oxford and Cambridge were established before the Tudor period, but there were a number of different colleges that were established within Oxford and within Cambridge, and they were founded during the Tudor period itself. So in terms of significance of education on Elizabethan, so this again could well be a 16-mark question that could come up. So around about a third of men and 10% of women were literate by the end of Elizabeth's reign. So comparing that with the 1530s, is that was only 20% of men and 10% of women. So what we need to kind of gather from that is that there was an increase in education of men. So that's a 10% increase is quite significant in terms of the whole population. But the amount of women that were literate between the 1530s and by 1603, there's no difference whatsoever. Okay, so in terms of talking about that, is that there was a significant increase of education on male Elizabethans, but there was no significance of education on female Elizabethans. The other issue that dampens the significance is the idea of cost. Okay, so cost was usually the biggest barrier to education, particularly for females. And what tended to happen is that because children of teenage age were already in work at that point, is that if they were in school, if they were sent to school, then that would not just be a loss of income in terms of paying for the school, but a loss of income instead because they're not actually working. However, in terms of the increase in significance, is that a little bit of education for boys meant a better paying job, whereas the role of women being in the home remained the same throughout the Tudor period. So there's got to be a very key difference within your answer if it is on the significance of education between the idea of male and female. More significant for male, not significant for females. Okay, so let's move on to the idea of the leisure activities. So moving away from education and looking at the idea of leisure. So in terms of who did what, if you were part of the nobility or part of the gentry, you were normally rich enough to be able to own your own horse, and so therefore you would normally be partaking in hunting. You could well be partaking in angling or fishing as well, and a very sort of like gentrified or noble sport was also to do with fencing. The last one is to do with the idea of real tennis. So the only way to describe that is a combination between sort of like grass court tennis and squash, in that it was held indoors and it was normally hit up against a wall. So therefore, there's a combination of tennis and squash there. In terms of the working people, the working class game, and it still is considered to be a working class game today, is football. However, it is not the same. Well, it's not the same sport then as it is now. In terms of, there's essentially very little in terms of rules. It wasn't 11-a-side. It was village versus village, and the whole concept was to sort of like try and get the ball. It wasn't necessarily a football, but from one village to the other. Didn't tend to work out too well. There was quite a lot of violence. There was quite a lot of injuries and a few deaths as well. So therefore, the pitch sizes varied from streets to entire fields between two villages. So in terms of spectator sports, so again, we're looking at the idea of leisure. So we've looked at how Elizabethans partook in sports, and this is how they spectated. So you've got baiting. So therefore, it's bear baiting, where a bear would be chained to a post with dogs unleashed against it. The bear's teeth were broken, so they could not bite the dogs, and many dogs died through this sport by being clawed by the bear. There was quite a significant increase in baiting, in the sense that it was so influential that there were special arenas that were built in London during the Tudor period, during the Elizabethan period, for baiting events. And all classes of people enjoyed watching bear baiting, including the Queen herself. You've then got the idea of cockfighting. So you've got cockerels, which are basically large chickens, large male chickens, that were made to wear special metal spurs to be able to attack each other. And many places had special arenas for cockfighting itself. And again, all classes enjoyed and bet huge sums of money on the outcomes of the fights. So as ever, there's always opposition in the Elizabethan period, and that opposition unsurprisingly came from the Puritans. They disapproved of baiting and cockfighting. However, the opposition was not based on the idea of the welfare of the animals. It was based on the idea that these events were tended to be held on Sundays, which is kind of the weekend for Elizabethans. They would normally work from Monday to Saturday, but Puritans were of the belief in their fundamental viewpoint that Sundays is considered to be the holy day, and that people should be spending that time praying and going to church rather than watching sports for entertainment purposes. Right, so let's move on to the idea of the theatre. So, in terms of the plays that were put on in theatres, mystery plays were the most common form at the start of Elizabeth's reign. And what happened was that they would normally take a story of the Bible and then bring that to life. However, Protestants didn't like the idea of these plays because it was seen as another way of Catholics influencing and controlling the interpretations of the Bible. So therefore, in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, her government banned those sorts of types of plays because they were worried about the encouragement of religious violence, particularly after the religious settlement itself. So what tended to happen was that the plays then became secular, so therefore non-religious. There was high demand, and they were also more exciting. and it led on to the new genre of the idea of comedies. And the demand over the Elizabethan period skyrocketed quite substantially, so therefore it led to theatre companies being formed, and these were normally established and funded by the nobles in those particular areas. So the popularity of plays led to purpose-built theatres, and many of these were in London. So what you've got to, if you want to name drop, if a theatres question comes up, then the Red Line that was situated in Whitechapel, and the Rose on the south bank of the Thames. What we are not saying is that we don't say the Globe Theatre. Okay, it's a very common misconception. We don't mention anything about Shakespeare. We don't mention anything about the Globe Theatre because that is not part of this particular era of Elizabethan England. That comes after the end of our specification, so we don't mention either of those two people. So let's look at the idea of the popularity. So the theatre was popular with all classes, and there were quite famous performers. So when they were part of a theatre company that travelled around the different theatres of England, is that they did attract large audiences. Only men were allowed to act. I suppose that's quite unsurprising given the time period. And female roles were normally taken by boys, by young boys. So it was quite inclusive in a way, in the sense that the poor people were able to pay to stand in the pit at the front of the stage, so they were able to spend a penny to watch the show. But the seats themselves were very expensive, and the idea that it was a social status, in that they were normally considered to be high up, higher than the lower classes in the pit. So if you were to be seen, then you were given kind of a higher status, even if the view wasn't particularly that great. So normally the richest of people would be suspended kind of above the stage itself, so they wouldn't necessarily see the play itself, but the people would see them, and that was more important. Their status was more important. Okay, and then let's move on to the idea of music. Okay, so many people played instruments, but instruments would obviously be very expensive to buy, and they were only found in noble and upper class households. However, bagpipes and fiddles were popular with lower classes because they were much more inexpensive. They were cheaper to buy. So wealthy families would employ their own musicians to play during meals, and lower classes would listen to music at fairs, markets, or public occasions, normally on, say, for example, May Day, bank holidays, and over the high holidays of Christianity. So new music was being composed to accompany the secular plays in theatre, so therefore music and theatre kind of goes hand in hand on that one. And more types of instruments were being invented, and so therefore, because there were different types of instruments being invented, that meant that more music being composed. So let's have a look at the idea of what type of question could come up. So it could well be a 12-mark question that comes up in this question. So it could be a question that hasn't come up yet, is explain why the use of the theatre increased during the reign of Elizabeth. So the three factors to look at is the idea of the introduction of secular plays. So therefore that becomes more important. And the theatre becomes more popular. The introduction of theatre companies and purpose-built theatres, so that the accessibility became easier for people in the different towns. And also the idea that it was accessible to all. So you talk about the idea of the pit, which allowed for poor people to enjoy the theatre, as well as the seating for the nobles and the gentry. So in terms of a summary for this topic, is that you've got education being expanded during Elizabeth's reign, but it was very limited. It was limited to boys, and the vast majority was still illiterate. So if you think it's 30% of men and 10% of women, you've therefore got 70% of men that were illiterate and 90% of females that were illiterate. So that's quite a substantial amount. Every town in England had a grammar school by 1577. So the increase of grammar schools, massive increase of grammar schools over the course of the first 20 years of Elizabeth's reign. You've got pastimes that were similar to modern ones, but sport was much more violent and much less structured. and the theatre thrived during the Elizabethan period. That there were many new plays and purpose-built theatres, and were popular with all classes. And Protestantism led to the development of new plays that were secular. Okay, so that's the end of this particular video. There'll be more to come over the course of the next few days for your exam this week. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to get notified of new videos.